before we go into the discussion with our panelists here, I asked myself, when I read this question, I thought, well, there are two underlying questions within this one question. One is, can South Asia ever be a bloc? Because it clearly does not, the countries within South Asia clearly does not operate as a bloc. One, and then of course comes the question, can it be a powerful bloc? And my opening up to South Asia probably happened in mid-90s, where I was in India. My parents were in political exile in India, which was funny for me because we were there in hidden identities and hidden different names, and I was fascinated by India because India kind of reflected what South Asia stood for, kind of the diversity in religion, in culture, 22 major languages. And you could see how people are different, once you move from one state to the other, and also with Bangladesh. But then, at some point we thought that there is a common thread that ties South Asia together. And so when I was reading this question, I was thinking like, can we build upon those common threads? So with those thoughts in mind, when I was asked to be a moderator, I was when I was given this question, Zafar Sobhan called me and I was like, Ashid, do you want to moderate this session? He said first, Ashid, there's a session on this in Dhaka Lit Fest. And I was scared. And then he said, no, you only have to be a moderator. And I saw, the person with least knowledge should always do the moderating. So I was thought, my responsibilities are well, curtailed. So I'll have an easy ride. So let me introduce you. We have on my left, Zafar Sobhan. He is the editor of Dhaka Tribune. He worked for years in another paper, Daily Star, and he's a well-known name in journalism in Bangladesh and also to the youths of Bangladesh. And he's clearly starting a youth revolution with a lot of hashtags of I am Bangladesh and so many other stuff. So on my right, we have a distinguished journalist, Victor Mallet, and he's the South Asia bureau chief of Financial Times. He has been living in India for 3 years, and we are fascinated to hear from them on their insights on this question. So I'll start with our guest, Victor Mallet, please.
Thanks. You mentioned India, and I think the mention of India is interesting because it shows the problems that you often have with any kind of bloc that you try to set up, whether it's Europe or a trading agreement in the Americas, or whether it's SAARC, is that you have the giant at the center of the bloc, and that can be problematic and it can be advantageous. But clearly the smaller, weaker, economically less important countries around the major power in the region often feel that they don't want to be part of a bloc where they're going to be dominated by a large partner. Now in Southeast Asia that means people are sort of worried about China. In this part of the world it means they're worried about India. In the Americas it means they're worried about the United States. And even in Europe, which is until now has been one of the more successful blocs, if you like, certainly a very successful trading bloc, in the currency union. Excuse me. In the currency union, people are scared of Germany because it's clearly dominating the single currency and the policies that go with that single currency. So once you become part of a bloc, if it's an economic bloc, for example, you lose your sovereignty over the currency if you have a currency union. And of course, some of the peripheral states in Europe are complaining that have been complaining quite loudly that the interests of Germany in setting interest rates for the euro have prevailed over the interests of the marginal states, which have smaller economies. So on the other hand, the plus side of having a giant in your midst is that, of course, you can look to that greater power for leadership. You can look to that power for particularly economic leadership, to help the other states in the union. So, it is largely the Germans and the French who are bailing out the Greeks, the peripheral power. But of course, you end up with this the problems of tensions. How much leadership would in a bloc of any kind would Bangladesh or Pakistan or Sri Lanka or Bhutan or Nepal be prepared to grant to India as the leading power in the region? So I think this is one of the issues you have to look at when you look at blocks and forming them and strengthening them is working out how you deal with the giant at the center of the block.
Just a follow-up question. I mean, and then we'll go and hear Zafar Bhai's observation. You said that an economic integration is, the difficulties of an economic integration can escalate with a big giant in the middle. But at some level, Europe has had a convergence in political values, right? And over, few months ago, and I think we were quite happy to see it, that Germany's foreign minister and the French foreign minister were in Dhaka to set up a joint embassy. And then these are two countries which had fought two world war, right? So when we see that, and now if somebody who has lived through Second World War, and now if they seeing that Germany and France are having one embassy in Bangladesh, that is clearly a message that a lot can happen. So my question here is that for that block to happen, do you think some sort of convergence on some sort of common political values within South Asia is necessary?
And clearly, as you say, I mean, Europe is a hugely successful economic union. But I mean, the creation of a joint embassy is a very belated thing because there are already European embassies in most countries, European Commission representations, and yet there are also national embassies for every major power in Europe. So you have an extraordinary sort of multiplication of effort, which in a truly united Europe wouldn't be necessary. I think one of the so it is. It's been a very slow process. The other thing is that one of the tenets of the European Union is ever closer political union, and this is sort of exposed a rift, if you like. Countries like Britain are very not at all keen on ever closer political union, and in fact, Britain is now even looking at a referendum to exit the bloc that we're talking about, to exit Europe. And you've also got, I think, quite importantly, as well as the forces of integration, which have been very powerful until now, you've also got forces of separation and disintegration. So you have Scotland, which held a referendum for independence, and it didn't, for leaving the United Kingdom, it didn't happen. You have Catalonia, which the Catalans are very keen to leave Spain. Now there is sort of an interesting wrinkle here, which is that they want to leave the nation states to which they belong. They consider the larger union, the European Union, as a kind of safety net. So they envisage leaving the nation state, which they want to, the independence-minded people want to leave that nation state, but they still want to remain part of the greater European Union for economic protection and so on. So, you have a sort of, if that process continued to its logical end, you would have a lot of mini countries or smaller nations that would still be part of a union. Now, I think in South Asia, obviously the whole process is much less far advanced. Where you don't even have free trade at this stage, right, across the borders. I had great fun the other day. I went during the wet season to Manipur, and I went to see for myself Asian Highway Number 1, which is supposed to link South Asia to East Asia, so essentially linking Delhi to Tokyo via Southeast Asia and so on. And you go on that Asian Highway Number 1, which I was on the border between India and Myanmar, Burma. And there's very little happening there. There's a lot of sort of petty border trade, but it's extremely difficult to ship goods across that border. The road isn't very good. The bureaucracy is enormous. There's corruption. You get shaken down by soldiers on the road, probably on both sides of the border, certainly on the Indian side of the border. So, that whole process of economic integration has barely begun in South Asia. And clearly political integration would be a very, very long way down the road. So I think, the first thing to look at is how far you can go with trade integration, economic integration, which would clearly be beneficial for all the countries in this region. I think it's astonishing how little trade there is between the countries of South Asia. between within that region, within that South Asian region, and it's it's clearly beneficial for India, for Bangladesh, for Burma, for Nepal to increase the level of that trade.
Thank you. I think it's fairly summarized in the sense that the challenges that South Asia are facing. We know that South Asia is home to 1.6 billion people. It's growing at fast rate, and yet it has more than 400 million people in poverty. And as he was saying, that it is one of the least traded region in the world. If you compare to Europe, I think trade within South Asia is less than 5%. And you can clearly see that there's some joint opportunities, right? I mean, I was listening to this investment potential in Nepal. Nepal is sitting on 80,000 megawatt of hydropower potential, and yet South Asia is not able to even mobilize any investment for such a win-win project. So, but I would want to question what he is saying. I mean, in some sense, I don't want to question. In some sense, I want to get this more into a debate. Whether do you think that to work as a powerful bloc, do you think what should precede one another? Do you think economic integration is going to precede political integration, or do you feel that some sort of convergence on political values is necessary for that sort of economic integration to happen?
I think if you're looking for a debate on this subject, I may have to disappoint you, because I'm not sure that I disagree too strongly with anything Victor has said. I mean, I think he's rightly pointed out that in the, at the very basic level, sort of the elephant in the room, sort of literally in a sense as well as figuratively, is the fact that you have South Asia dominated by one huge country, which is in fact geographically central, as well as central in every other way, and all of the other countries are both geographically and metaphorically peripheral to India. And I think that is a huge obstacle to face. I mean, I think certainly, if you talk about Europe, yes, Germany is, other countries do, worry about German domination, but I think that level of sort of inequality in the size of the economies is not really as great there as it is perhaps in South Asia. I think the second issue which makes it very problematic for us is, of course, the second biggest economy in the region is Pakistan, and I think where you have the two biggest countries who are at loggerheads with one another. And I think that is really, the biggest obstacle we face in turning South Asia into a bloc. So, these are two fairly insuperable problems which we face. And then the third problem is the one which you alluded to, which is the political will there? Is there a project there says that, okay, we are going to sit down and we're going to have this is all in all of our interests. And I think the interesting thing is, if one were to talk to economists or experts or political scientists, they would all, trade experts, they would all agree that, greater integration is certainly in the interest of all of the countries. This is something which could work to our advantage. Victor has mentioned, if you look at intra-regional trade, it's at a really abysmal level compared to any other comparable region around the world. And certainly if that were to be boosted, that would be good for everyone. I mean, there are very few things in, when you look at sort of economic relations which qualify as win-win, but I think greater regional integration is one of the very few which does. Nevertheless, whether the political will is there is a serious question, because I think there are strong constituencies in every country which have invested a great deal in ensuring that they've based their entire political fortunes on opposing greater integration. And I think at the popular level, this is something which a lot of groundwork still needs to be laid to actually get beyond the natural suspicion people have. And I know you alluded to the fact that, France and Germany have fought 2 world wars, and if they can do it, then why can't we? And I mean, and yes and no. I mean, that's a truism. They have. I somehow think that the obstacles here again would be greater, and there's sort of all sorts of complicated reasons why. I mean, I think after the Second World War, because there was a hot war which had come to a close, then Europe was completely reshaped at that point, and then there was a project was started to say that, okay, let us make sure that we move ahead in a different direction, and so the catastrophes of the earlier part of the century are not repeated. I don't think there was a concerted sort of joint effort, continent-wide, and I think it started, in fact, with was it the a coal union, I believe, between Germany and France.
Coal and steel. Yeah.
Coal and steel union, and then it sort of worked on beyond that. I'm not sure we're ready for that yet, though.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to raise the point about very basic building blocks. One of the people on the panel is not here, Fasih Ahmed from Pakistan, because he couldn't get a visa in time, because he wasn't granted a visa in time by the Bangladeshis. So we're talking about very basic steps towards the beginnings of integration, which haven't been taken yet. I was under the impression coming here, I came from Delhi, that the Indians didn't need visas to come to Bangladesh because they're all members of SARC. But clearly they do, I was told by my Indian colleagues on the plane. So, I mean, really simple bureaucratic diplomatic procedures need to sort of precede everything else, and then you've got to have visa-free travel, or at least easy travel between the countries of the region, and then you've got to have easy trading relationships, and then you've got to have the physical infrastructure for the trade in place, and then you can talk much later about political integration. I mean, obviously the India-Pakistan dispute is a huge obstacle in the face of any integration in South Asia. I as a journalist, I travel to Pakistan quite often from India, and it's the most extraordinary experience every time. You fly to Amritsar and then you go by road to Lahore, and of course they're both in the Punjab. Everybody speaks Punjabi on either side of the border, but it's the quietest border post in the world. Usually there's one or two people crossing the border in each direction. Families visiting each other, or occasional sort of foreign business people. But it's absurd. It should be the busiest border in the world, bar none. And in fact, of course, ultimately, the border shouldn't be there at all. One of the great pleasures of traveling in Europe, not including the UK, because we're not part of the Schengen arrangement, is that there is border-free travel, which of course has now become controversial because of the terrorist attacks in Paris. But I just think looking at blocks, you have to begin with the basics of ease of travel, ease of trade, and then ultimately you can look at complicated things like common currencies, common political representation. I mean, I covered the sort of the birth of the enlarged ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and even there, among quite developed economies, there's there's not enough real integration yet, and it's a very, very slow process. I mean, I remember 20 or more years, well, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I think, covering the haze from the fires in Indonesia that blanketed Singapore, parts of Malaysia, and southern Thailand, and everybody saying, well, ASEAN, we're going to cooperate, we're going to deal with this. And 25 years on, the same problem is there, nothing has been done. The Singaporeans are complaining about the fact that their air is filled with smoke every year around this time because the forests of Indonesia, of Sumatra, are being burnt by corrupt logging companies and so on, and nothing's been done, and ASEAN has proved completely unable to deal with a problem which is a sort of classic problem where they could actually collaborate with each other to sort it out. So yeah, basic steps first, I think, before. I just one point in the program. It does say something interesting. It says that the lack of integration in South Asia has stifled growth, but actually, I'm not sure that's true. Although it is true that integration would increase growth. Actually, you look at the large, the major economies of South Asia are actually doing extremely well at the moment compared to the rest of the world. That includes Bangladesh, 6% plus growth a year, I think. It includes Pakistan, 4% plus, India, 7% plus. I mean, they could do better, but these are pretty impressive growth figures compared to the rest of the world, including the rest of the emerging markets. So we shouldn't be too gloomy about the economic situation in South Asia, despite the lack of integration.
No, I mean, I think this is fairly established that South Asia, in terms of what is happening on the economic front, is clearly amazing, given where the global trends are. But I mean, it's interesting that whenever you think of South Asia as a power bloc, the the great old rivalry between India and Pakistan is nevertheless mentioned. But, as a social scientist, we are always asked with a duty to form a trend, right? How things are. Is it improving? Is it, is it deteriorating or something? And trust me, on India-Pakistan relationship over the last 25 years, I am not been able to draw a curve. I don't know whether I should say, okay, maybe, after Kargil, they never had a hot war. So maybe we can say something, there's some room for hope. But living in India, and I'm going to come back to you again, but I'm going to go here because you're living in Delhi with this new government, which is center-right, extremely nationalist, and some kind of has this religious mandate of Hindutva with its foreign policy. Do you think over the next 5 years there's any, or three years to be precise, any scope for India-Pakistan relation to improve?
It's a very good question. And funnily enough, I mean, one of the first things that Narendra Modi did when he became Prime Minister of India a year and a half ago was to immediately and radically try to improve relations with India's near neighbors, including Bangladesh, where it hasn't gone too badly, including Pakistan, where it hasn't gone well at all, including Nepal, where it went very well initially and now has turned sour. But, I think myself and a lot of people thought this was very sensible because India was notable for having very bad relations with its immediate neighbors, quite unnecessarily bad relations with several states, Sri Lanka, even the Maldives, and I think Modi, to his credit, moved very quickly to try and change that. He invited all the South Asian leaders, including Nawaz Sharif of Pakistan, to his inauguration, and that was a very sensible thing to do, I think, before engaging with the great powers, with China, with the US, with Europe and so on. He went straight to the neighbors, and of course his first visit, I think, was to Bhutan. He was making a point that India needed to improve ties with its neighbors, and I think he was completely right. But unfortunately, for several reasons, the process has sort of slowed down. Although I think with Bangladesh, actually, it's still fairly much on track because there's a sort of community of interest between the Awami League and the BJP, probably.
I think where I want to hear your insight is, in Bangladesh also, I think there is a clear, as Zafar bhai mentioned like a few minutes ago, that there's clearly a constituency which has built a huge political capital on its anti-Indian political rhetoric or policies, right? We have seen a change in tone recently, but we don't know whether those tones can be trusted. But coming back to you, we have seen an interesting development a few months ago, or pardon my knowledge gap, it's probably 6 months or more. But with the BBIN, if you're familiar with the agreement, that the transportation agreement that happened, it was supposed to be a SARC agreement, right? And Pakistan backed out and of course it fell through. But then Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, without Pakistan, formed that integration. So maybe some hope there that we, even if the two elephants are not, I don't want to say one elephant in the room, but I would rather say two elephant or three elephant. But do you think that these micro steps are possible way forward for the region?
Yeah, I think certainly, removing Pakistan from the equation makes things much easier. And looking at, as you said, sort of a South Asia sort of growth quadrangle, I think that was one of the arrangements. And then you have BBBI, which is just looking at a more sub-regional level, is certainly the smarter way to go. But I would like to address Victor's point. I actually think that I'm not so sure that actually relations between Bangladesh and India are at that a great or positive level. I certainly think at the government-to-government level they're going very well, but I think there's still a lot of popular unhappiness. I think Modi had a very much touted, celebrated trip here to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is expected to get a great deal from the trip. And then I think they felt that when sort of Modi went away, India got everything and Bangladesh got very little. And how true that is necessarily is, a subject for debate, because a lot of the benefits one gets, sort of trade benefits and what have you, are not exactly tangible. They're not exactly something which are visible to the man or woman in the street. But nevertheless, I mean, I think it's important in terms of the perception. So there was a sort of a wave of Modi mania when he first came here, and everyone, sort of bought into it. But I think now, especially, as things are going south with the Modi government in India, it is, being pilloried for authoritarianism, its attacks on freedom of expression. People, stories such as, not that this is a government act, but, you have the Dadri case of the gentleman who was lynched for eating beef. These things, and certainly there's a feeling in Bangladesh, as indeed in India, that this wouldn't be happening if there wasn't some kind of sort of, tacit approval or at least inaction by the government in place. And so I think actually that relationship is far more tenuous and is in far more trouble than actually people think. And I think another problem is that the current government also is facing its own issues in terms of popularity. It's, also turned fairly autocratic in terms of how it is dealing with not just the political opposition, but how it's dealing with the media, how it is dealing with civil society. And I think there's a perception that, one of the things which shores this government up is its very good relationship with India. So as long as this government continues along this path, that is actually not going to help Indo-Bangladesh relations. And I think, in a sense...
You mean more people-to-people relation, or the kind of the relation in terms of popular sentiments?
Yeah, I'm talking about the popular sentiment. I mean, I think, and I think that's important because at the underlying level, the popular sentiment at some level needs to be there for you to take all of the steps you're talking about when you said, very small building blocks in terms of, I don't know, visa regimens, things like that.
I'm interested by what you're saying about the way, domestic policy or domestic politics in a place like India can obviously have an effect on its relationships with its neighbors. And then you get into the very vexed issue of religion and religious fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic fundamentalism or whether it's Hindu fundamentalism, and that is clearly an issue. I mean, I wrote an article when Modi went to Silicon Valley because Modi was sort of portraying himself as a liberal, focused entirely on development and IT and Facebook. But back home, things were not like that at all. He was being he and his government were being extremely sort of primitive in the sense of, in the political sense of, focusing on Hindu values, more or less demonizing Muslims because of the Bihar election. And the contrast, and I basically said in today's world, you can't say one thing to an audience in California and another thing to an audience in India and not expect the world to notice. And you have to decide what you really are and what you believe in and what you want to focus on. And clearly that might have had an effect in Bangladesh as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think not just me. I mean, I think most people finding it extremely hard to buy Narendra Modi is an integrationist. Because his entire political philosophy, the political philosophy of the party he leads and the wing of the party that he leads in the sort of the socio-political movement that it represents is a very exclusivist philosophy.
And to be fair, the Indians would say the same about Pakistan. They would say, look, we're open to a deal with Pakistan, but Pakistan has to stop harboring Islamist terrorists who blow up Mumbai and the hotels in Mumbai. And it's a fair point as well. So
yeah.
on all sides, you have a sort of huge, almost, well, apparently impassable obstacle in terms of their approach to religious fundamentalism, I guess. It's part of it.
Coming to both of you, I mean, both of you have highlighted that there is a tendency to throw the ball in other people's court, right? So you give me water, then we will think about negotiation. You give me transit, then we will think about a union, and the famous Pakistan-India spat. But clearly, if political leadership in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and I don't want to demean Bhutan or Nepal, but let's say with these three countries on our focus, if we go right in all sides, right? If the political leadership are right-leaning in terms of their focus on religion in the politics, clearly that's an obstacle for integration, right? I mean, so when I was brainstorming on, is there certain values where there needs to be a political convergence? I don't necessarily envision a European Parliament sort of framework in Bangladesh in next 10 years, or in India. But what I mean that at the intellectual level, can or at the political level, is there any appetite for thinking that these are the common set of values that will help integration? That might be secularism, that might be many other dimensions, but there must be an agreement on certain types of political values, without which integration is just a loose word.
No, I mean, that's a very interesting point. I've never really thought about it in exactly the terms you have articulated just now, and I think you're absolutely right. And let's start, with secularism. And I think certainly, that is almost a sort of a sine qua non, because, if you don't have secular entities in power in the main countries, I think the underlying values which you would need to underpin regional integration would not actually exist. And if we're moving away from that, certainly, and I think the biggest danger or the biggest sort of disappointment, you could say, is that India for so many years has been like the secular beacon for all of us, not just in South Asia, but perhaps in the whole world. We sort of look to it, not just for its democratic tradition, but for its secular tradition, how it has managed to, had so many communities and religions coexist, in relative harmony compared to perhaps many other countries which have had fewer potential for rifts. And so if that is coming apart at the seams, that's, I think in that sense, integration becomes a distant dream. I think we then have far more immediate problems facing us here in the region.
But I think integration and communication leads to more integration and more communication. One of the problems is that we've got these sort of slightly artificial, partly colonial era borders that don't reflect cultural boundaries at all. So if you talk to
isn't that all borders in Africa?
Yes,
they're like
absolutely,
straight lines.
and with similar problems but similar advantages as well. Which is that actually, I think one should look at this optimistically, in the sense that my colleague in Islamabad is a Punjabi. And every time he comes across to India, which is not very often because it's hard to get a visa, he says, it's amazing. The Indians, they speak Punjabi and they're just like us and they're very friendly. And likewise, you talk to Indians who cross into Pakistani Punjab, and of course, many people have families there, the connections are all, they say, gosh, they're just like us. They eat the same food, they like the same music, and they're all Punjabis. And, and the same happens in Bengal. The idea that these sort of are separate places. Bengal is Bengal and always has been, and it doesn't really matter. If you look at it optimistically, it doesn't matter which side of the border you are, because there are cultural similarities, there are linguistic, not just similarities, but complete commonality. So I think that what you need is more communication, more free media sort of exchanges, more. The great problem between Pakistan and India is that they don't talk to each other, is that there's no sort of constituency, strong constituency in either India or Pakistan for saying this border is absurd. We know it's absurd, it's culturally ridiculous, and it's a historical sort of product of partition, but actually, we really can communicate with each other quite normally. It was a great disappointment that Manmohan Singh, who was born on the Pakistani side of Punjab, there was always this talk he was going to go and visit his birthplace and talk to Nawaz Sharif in Punjabi, and that would have been great, but it never happened. And so these things that don't happen, these communications, whether between prime ministers or between ordinary people, the longer that non-communication happens, the harder it gets to really have integration and sort of economic links, and it's just, in a way, it's completely absurd that there isn't a much more free transfer of people and ideas and trade between West Bengal and Bangladesh and between the two halves of the Punjab on the other side of India. So I just think somehow one has to sort of leverage those cultural links. I mean, to give you a European example, when I grew up as a child in Britain, it was all about the Second World War. All our comics, a lot of our books were about the Second World War and the wicked Germans, and my, obviously my dad was in the Second World War at the end, and that was what we did at school. We played, Germans and Brits, and we flew Spitfires and Messerschmitts made of, plastic at each other, and that was our sort of upbringing, and we thought that, the nasties were wicked and the Japanese were these cruel killers, and of course, I mean they were, but we have moved on since then, and there is this wonderful sense that you go to London, and it is a truly cosmopolitan city. I mean, it is, if an Islamist brigade succeeds in letting off a bomb, they will kill people of many nationalities, as they did at the World Trade Center in New York, and many religions. This is not, it's impossible to find your way around London without an iPhone or something, because you ask somebody and no one is from London. Everybody is from somewhere else, and they're from this, they're from South Asia, they're from Thailand, they're from France. London is something like the 4th biggest French city in the world now. There are loads of French people, there are loads of German people. It is there is real cultural and popular integration across Europe, which is hugely beneficial, and we saw that in Paris, the way people came together after this attack, and you saw also people of many different nationalities were caught up in these events, because Paris is also a cosmopolitan city. So somehow one has to make Asian capitals, South Asian capitals, and South Asian cities as cosmopolitan eventually, as Europe, and we have the means to do that because of linguistic similarities.
I think that's a great point, and I think I'll take your final observation, but I just want to touch on one important point which he mentioned, is that I think that the hope lies with the fact that somewhere deep down in our heart, we do sense that similarity. That when I was, as a student in UK, when I had, when I mingled with the wicked Pakistanis, and the things we were, raised to believe in, but then you realize that these perceptions break down when we sit down and gossip, and you see that how similar we are in our taste for music, in our taste for history, in our taste for culture. So I guess the hope lies with that instinct that somewhere deep down in our heart, we know that South Asia are countries within South Asia are multiple flowers coming from probably the same root.
Well, I mean, certainly. I mean, my family, actually, I have family in Bangladesh, I have family in India, I have family in Pakistan, and I think that is not, I don't think that's particularly unusual. No, I think I've come across other families like that as well, and I think certainly in my experiences outside of Asia, as you say, when you're in college in the UK or the US, it really doesn't matter whether you're a Pakistani, Indian, or Bangladeshi. You're part of a South Asian community, and I think perhaps there is hope as we move on towards the next generation. I would actually suggest, though, that from the Bangladeshi perspective, we need to be spending more time looking at Southeast Asia, because when you think about it, Bangkok is just about as far away from Dhaka as New Delhi is. And, I'm like I said, I'm not sure if they're particularly keen to have us, but I certainly think there's a lot of benefits for us to see if we can, do more business with ASEAN as a bloc, because I really just don't see SAARC going anywhere, I'm afraid to say. Okay. And this is, unfortunately, this is someone I've spent many years, writing about South Asia. I've written about the costs of non-cooperation, and how I think fundamentally, I don't think any of us on this panel disagree. We think it's a good idea, and I think philosophically, we are certainly all aligned in that direction. And I think there are enough people not just, we've sort of shrunk it down now to talking about India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, but of course, let's not forget, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bhutan, all of that. And I think there is a large constituency which feels the same way. I'm just not sure that it's politically feasible in the foreseeable future, and I think we have to deal with the realities as we find them.
Thank you, both of you. We will. I think we know that this, the question that we were trying to answer, demands more time. But like we are constrained with time, is the most scarcest unit that we have. But we have 10 minutes left. I would love to have some questions for the panelists. Yes, yes, sir. I'll go with you, sir. Rahman, sir.
Well, I enjoyed the discussion, but I got the impression that you overplayed the role of the interstate relationship. I mean, actually, if you look at the reality on the ground, most of the interaction within the South Asian region is taking place outside the domain of the state. I mean, the main trading relationship of Bangladesh, of course, even officially, is with India. Similarly with Nepal, similarly with Sri Lanka in terms of their imports. But more to the point, we have a huge export of people to India. And in return, we have huge reciprocal import of cows from India. So in fact, none of these are sort of factored into the trade statistics, and in fact would disproportionately, in fact, enhance the global value of trade. More to the point, there is an enormous movement of people across borders. If you generally add up the number of Bangladeshis traveling to India for medical or religious purposes or even for tourism, and also in fact you see the attendance of virtually every household watching Indian TV programs, a level of integration is taking place where a significant population within Bangladesh who never in 24 years of life with Pakistan learned to speak in Urdu have now actually learned Hindi simply by sort of watching television. So this aspect of the relationship should actually be kept in mind when you in fact talk of the nature of the relationship. And basically the real question should be asked is that whilst there is a huge mood for cooperation amongst the people, whatever is happening or not happening is going on in spite of the state and not because of the state. After all, a central element in Indo-Pakistan relationships, you must remember, is because Indo-Pakistan relationships are not run by the Foreign Ministry of Pakistan, but by its intelligence agencies. So they have now acquired a huge veto power, which can in fact override business and every other interest over there. So these are elements which should be taken into account. And if you had a genuine democratization going on where public and popular opinion was taken into account, you would have a different perspective on South Asian relations.
Thank you, sir. I think we did you. So I see a clear difference in Rahman sir. Along with me, I feel that the popular. I don't really think that people per se are anti-integration or anti-Indian. I think there are issues that agitate people, but you were of the opinion that the popular sentiment is not. So is there a difference in opinion in the family?
Well, I think people's appetite for watching Hindi TV shows does not necessarily translate into a fondness for Indian culture or India as a country. I think one of the people who is famously addicted to Indian TV serials is the ex-Prime Minister Begum Khalida Zia. So you can draw your own conclusions from that.
Okay. Okay. Any observation?
No,
on
I
that?
mean, I just, to me, this is good news. I mean, I agree with you, and I think, the issue is very much integration in spite of governments and nation states, which is exactly what happens everywhere. But it's interesting. You make the point that it happens here. I got stuck in a massive traffic jam of trucks coming from the Indian border when I went with a fellow journalist to the Indian border here, and with trucks full of cows, coming across the border, obviously smuggled in enormous numbers. And the issue of people learning Hindi, that's gone as far as Afghanistan and Central Asia, where people watch a lot of Bollywood movies as well. So, but I think this is all a positive trend. I remember covering Africa years ago and being at African borders and realizing that a lot of trade took place in spite of governments, because small traders would smuggle things across the borders because there was demand on one side and supply on the other, and nothing really can stop that. And that again was very positive because it kept African economies going at a level of prosperity that was not reflected at all in the official trade statistics. So yeah, it's good news, I think.
Any more questions, sir? Please mention your name and.
Okay. Let me introduce myself. My name is Nazmul Hassan. I am an industrialist and businessman, as well as a consultant of World Bank. Okay, so my vision is that in the last 5 to 6 years, the SAARC economy has developed a lot. inter-exchange except the Pakistan. You know, you see the GDP of this country like India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives has a strong GDP, even better than any European countries. So that is why this economy is very big prospect in very near future. Also, you know, the internal communication between the transit and all these facilities has just started. So it is the basic need of each country to grow up their economy for this type of interaction. So it is growing fast. So Pakistan is lacking far behind in this to cope up on this economic growth. I don't
think
know.
Pakistan is also growing fast.
Growing, but they cannot cope up with these communities. That is why their GDP is less than these countries.
Can you start? If you have any questions, sir, can we go straight to the question?
Yes, my question is that, so we have to mobilize these things in a political way. It should be the target of our economic growth. Okay.
Thank you.
I mean, can I just say, I think it would be nice if this economic growth you talked about, which is completely true in South Asia, was the result of greater integration. But I fear that the real reason why South Asian economies have been doing so well, particularly India and Pakistan, is because they import oil and the price of oil has collapsed. And this has been an enormous boost to certainly the economy of India. So the price of its imports has collapsed, the price of its exports has remained pretty stable. So you know, it's, I think a lot of the economic advantages that South Asia is feeling is because in many cases they're not commodity exporting countries that have been hit by the decline in the slowdown in the world economy.
Yes. Any more questions, sir? Yes. And we'll come back to you after that.
Thank you. My name is Lundgren. I'm Swedish. Hence, I'm coming from a part of the world where integration has been very successful, namely the Nordic Council, which was formed after the Second World War. Even though some of the countries, because of the World War, joined NATO, and Sweden was non-allied, and Finland had a different position again, still this council was formed, and only one labour market, no passports needed, and so forth. But then again, the EU, certain countries become members, but others, like Norway, not. So it's a complex picture, but still deep integration. Now, of course, when it comes, as I indicated, when it comes to security, it's not the core of the story at all. Even though there have been, of course, no war for so long. When it comes to security here, normally you ask yourself, is there some kind of regional security mechanism? Is there conflict management? How are non-traditional threats handled? Like epidemics or floods or climate change issues and so forth, and how much has SARC mattered in all these contexts? Thank you.
I'm afraid I'm not an expert on this, but my guess is that there's not nearly enough on that score. You know, that actually the institution, especially SARC, that should be doing these things is very, very undeveloped in those very important areas for cooperation. So in fact, my guess is that the region looks much more to international institutions. In the case of epidemics, it would be the WHO, the World Health Organization. In the case of climate change, you know, I just don't, at least I don't perceive anything coming out of SARC that suggests anything remotely like useful cooperation on sort of regional crises, whether they're agricultural or health or environmental or anything else, and certainly not strategy, but I may be wrong.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And two of the issues you had mentioned, for instance, when you talk about climate change, or if you talk about, let's say, water sharing, for instance, in fact, not only is there no cooperation on these issues, the interests of the sort of constituent countries actually run fairly counter to one another. And so, for instance, India's position on climate change is very, very different from Bangladesh's position simply because their interests are different. Also, when it comes to, you know, I think it's in both countries' interest to have a good water sharing arrangement, but of course, you know, water is in some levels a zero-sum game, more for me is less for you. And so that's the problem. You also have to move sort of away from crisis. I know that there are issues at sort of the World Trade Organization where you have Pakistan, for instance, voting against the interests of Bangladesh and the other LDC countries, because there were issues of what kind of benefits LDCs would get compared to other countries. And since Pakistan was not an LDC, it had a different opinion. It wouldn't really look at this issue through a SARC perspective. It was very difficult to form a SARC bloc on this. So, I mean, I think, again, the commonality of interest at the political level, and certainly when it comes in terms of the policy level, doesn't appear to be there, even though it would seem to make a lot of sense.
And it's easier to integrate smaller populations. I mean, what's the population of Scandinavia, roughly? 25 million, which is roughly the population of Delhi. So, you know, that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem when you're trying to integrate these very large populations, you know. And although not culturally identical, at least there are sort of cultural connections, right? Yeah, yeah.
So I think I'll take 2 more questions and then I'll come back to the response. So first I will go there and then I'll come to the front row here. So 2 more questions and then I'll ask the panelists to please introduce yourself,
Hi.
sir.
Hello. Hi, I'm Joseph. I'm a journalist. I was quite interested in what you were saying about the relationship between trade and liberalism and openness towards other societies or communities within the region. I mean, do you think that, I mean, because there's quite a lot of empirical studies to suggest that greater opening economies or rapidly opening economies tend to have governments which pass more repressive laws on minorities. And I'm just wondering what you made of that kind of that relationship, or if you know what the panelists sort of make of that situation.
We'll come back to this question.
Yeah.
And then, sir. I don't think there has been.
I know what he's talking about.
Okay.
I'll address
Sir.
My name is Ashiqur Rahman. I'm an architect. For last few years, I had been working on a museum. It's based on partition of 47, and for that reason, I had been looking in the internet what's going on in the all over the world, and I see a lot of hints of integration. Like in Berkeley University, Gunita Singh Valla, she has initiated to collect the oral history of 10,000 survivors of partition. And a lot of young stars they are working on it, and they are knowing each other in subcontinent. And one journalist, Wasim Rafiki, he has launched a web page, Idea of India. He is trying to show the integration of Hindu and Muslim all over India, because the media only portrays the divides and the riots, but he's trying to show the interrelations. And there are another group, they're working on the textbooks, because textbook is a mode of dividation, because most of the textbooks are biased as long as the account of partition is concerned. So do you think that the internet and global medias and the relationship through the internet, it can make some change in your future?
I mean, you know, I think that's a really good point, because whether we like it or not, there is massive global integration, global cultural integration on a huge, unprecedented scale and at unprecedented speed as a result, partly of social media, but also every other technological and you know, transport development that we're looking at. So yes, I mean, it's not whether it's good or bad, it's not going to stop. And you know, the bad things, if you like, are, you know, we lose a lot of languages, a lot of languages that are only spoken by a few people. They're disappearing at the rate of, I forget, but you know, probably 100 a year. I mean, because you know, everybody is speaking another commoner language, like whether it's Chinese or Hindi or English. You know, a lot of small tribal or clan languages are just disappearing, and you know, that's a bad thing because we're losing cultural richness. But it's a sign of the integration you're talking about, which is huge, huge. And it's not just the children of, you know, relatively wealthy people like me or educated people. It's everybody. Everybody is engaged in this astonishing, you know, cultural exchange. I mean, I think India is now the world's #2 Facebook country, or shortly about to become it. You know, and you know, with 30%
And
of the
Bangladesh now is 0. So for
oh
last
yeah,
2 days.
well, a good point. Well, maybe that comes back to his issue of repression of
Yeah.
minorities.
Yeah, back to Joseph's one. And one of the things I've read, I think Amy Chua's written this book about market-dominant minorities who oftentimes come under threat with greater openness. I'm not sure that analysis is necessarily sort of applicable to this part of the region, though she's identified various market-dominant minorities, largely, I think, ethnic Chinese all over Southeast Asia. And I think with the openness of Southeast Asian societies, they did face a backlash. And she also talked about other communities in the old Soviet Union in Africa. That hasn't happened. I mean, I think, interestingly enough, though, minorities are under increased pressure in the region, certainly in India, and I think we're also seeing an uptick here in Bangladesh. I'm not sure if that's a response to or has anything to do with opening up of the economy per se. I think that there are sort of other forces at play there.
I think we will come back. I think this is probably the end of this session. I just want to thank the panelists, Victor and Zafar Bhai, for their valuable insights. I think if I have to sum it up in one line, I think hope lies with people and not with politics.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you.